Hey there, welcome to episode 77 of the Social Business Engine podcast. This is the podcast where I invite leaders from brands across all industries who are excited to share with you how they use social media in their business strategy. I'm Bernie Borges, CEO of Find and Convert and your host of the Social Business Engine podcast. On this episode, you're going to meet Jim Fields. Jim is Vice President of Customer Experience at SAP. On this episode, Jim and I discussed the role of an executive in a large enterprise and the balancing act that it requires between strategy, tactics, talent development, and employee advocacy. We discuss the mix of skills needed for the modern executive in the digitally minded enterprise. Now, this episode is sponsored by Vanilla Forums, creators of a popular online community platform used by companies to build private online communities on your website. We're publishing a Social Business Journal issue with Vanilla titled The Community Playbook. This guide provides all the information you need to get your online community started and to keep it engaged. If you're subscribed by email to get our weekly podcast updates, which we send every Friday, then you'll be notified when this journal gets published. If you're not subscribed to our weekly updates, you can get subscribed by texting SBE Show to 38470. And it's not case sensitive. Again, text SBE Show to 38470. And of course, if you're on your desktop, you can just as easily subscribe by hitting our subscribe page at socialbusinessengine.com. And now, here's my interview with Jim Fields from SAP. Jim, welcome to the Social Business Engine podcast.
Thank you, Bernie. I'm very excited to be here today.
Great. Well, let's dive in. Jim, you have an interesting background. You are an executive at a very large global enterprise, but you're also a serial entrepreneur. And where I'd like to begin our conversation is a little bit about that journey. I'd like to know how your background as an entrepreneur has contributed or prepared you, however you want to frame it, Jim, for your management responsibilities in a large enterprise.
Yeah, that's a great question, Bernie. And sometimes I wonder how I got here myself when I look back over the years. But I was first introduced to technology when I was working in the publishing business at McGraw-Hill in New York City. I had been an English major in college, and it was a natural kind of path, to go into publishing. And that was just when the automation of manuscripts was coming into the market. I graduated college the year the IBM PC was first released, so that might give you a sense of the convergence of these technologies. Mm-hmm. What would be the early versions of desktop publishing type technology, and got intrigued by it and wanted to really go deeper into it. And so then I started working initially in training and documentation for software companies, and then, ultimately moved into some of the early kind of pioneers in what became the ERP or enterprise resource planning industry, which is now a multi-trillion-dollar industry globally. Mm-hmm. And so if you ever work in a startup culture, you do not have typically a lot of resources at your disposal to do things. So you need to be very self-reliant and very multidisciplinary, both personally and, as groups, as to how you get things done. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of forces you to develop a diverse set of skills that you can put toward achieving a particular outcome. And it was in those days, it was such a fast growing industry. You didn't really need a deep technology background to get involved and to be given responsibility for running pieces of the business. It was more, hey, this guy seems smart, so let's ask him to do more, right? And it was a very exciting time to be, through that growth curve, throughout the late 80s and all through the 90s. And so some of those companies that I was with are now part of larger organizations like Oracle, Infor, SunGard and people like that.
So it's interesting,
And
Jim. Then what I'm hearing in your
yep,
career path is that you were with some of these small startups who then got absorbed into some of the larger companies that you wound up working for. Is that right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've learned over the years is that you can continue to be entrepreneurial, and your entrepreneurial background and skills serve you well within large organizations. If you continue to try and innovate, within the boundaries of what's possible. A lot of people look at big companies as kind of slower moving and less innovative than smaller companies, and that's not always the case.
Right.
In many ways, you have more resources at your disposal to actually do things.
Right.
You just need to not let the obstacles of a big company get in your way.
Right. Well, it's interesting when I contrast the picture you're painting of your career. We're of similar age range. I grew up in technology in the 80s, but my career path was in the corporate world, and a couple of actually one large enterprise and then some mid-sized and smaller companies. And ironically, Jim, I spent a few years in the ERP software space, so I know of it from the 90s. It's changed quite a bit since the 90s. That was back in the client-server, mainframe and client-server days. But then I launched my digital marketing agency 13 years ago, so I took the entrepreneurial route. So I went from corporate to entrepreneurial and then have stayed in that small entrepreneurial world since then. So I can completely relate to the whole point about how you've got to be multidisciplinary and really wear many hats in the entrepreneurial world. So interesting contrast. Jim, let's talk about your current role. Can you tell us exactly what does Vice President of Customer Experience do at SAP?
So we look at things like how can we find new ways to engage with customers and prospects, earlier in their decision cycles. How can we, provide insight and engagement in ways that help build brand preference, and hopefully gain, their trust in the voice that we bring to the market. How can we continue to innovate our marketing strategies and tactics in ways that they make it easier for customers to understand the value that we can bring to them, and make it easier for them to engage with us. And also look across, I call it finding margins between the organizational silos. A lot of what we do is connect pieces within the organization to create a more holistic experience for the customer, as opposed to maybe a bunch of serial type interactions that they might have otherwise.
I'd like to talk about that a little bit more, because actually that's where I wanted to go next. As you were describing what you do in this role, heading up customer experience, and how you're looking for ways to find ways to engage with customers and prospects earlier and influence decisions, I would think that does require a lot of collaboration across different parts of the organization. So can you elaborate on that, Jim? How do you achieve that in such a large organization like SAP?
Yeah, I think there's two keys to that. And we are, like many technology companies, we're basically full of computer scientists and MBAs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's our basic demographic.
Mm-hmm.
So part of our challenge is to help them step outside their typical way of looking at the world and understand from the customer's point of view, right, what those interaction and touch points with the organization, need to be. And the way we try and approach it is because you can't mandate stuff. I mean, you can mandate stuff, but over time, people find ways to get around mandates.
Right.
What you need to do is, first of all, show them what it is you're trying to accomplish. So find opportunities to actually do the things that you want them to come along and help you do. So giving someone a 40-page PowerPoint and taking them through and trying to explain the concept of what you have in mind is a lot less powerful than actually maybe prototyping that thing and saying, "Hey, what if we had this? Wouldn't that help you?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
And enables them to see it, touch it, feel it, and kind of begin to invest themselves in wanting to be part of that. And that kind of leads to the second part, which is, to create the win-win. It's an old concept, but it still works, right? If I come to you and I say, "Hey, Bernie, I need you to do this for me because, it should be part of your job, or you need to be a good corporate citizen," you may or may not want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You may like me and do it as a favor or whatever. But if I can say, "Hey, Bernie, look, I've been thinking about our business, and if we were to do this together, and you contributed this, these resources or this infrastructure, or help develop this strategy in conjunction with us, here's what you would get out of it," right?
Okay.
And creating that win for other teams creates a natural collaboration.
Sure, and as social creatures, we all want recognition, we all want promotions and raises, and so to your point, Jim, if it's a win-win scenario for me and the group that I work for, or my own boss, that kind of thing. So is that an example of what you're getting at?
And when people look at it, like, I use a phrase with our team sometimes because we overlay a lot of organizations and do a lot of things by influence as opposed to ownership. And so we have a phrase that we use that if your fingerprints are on something, your name doesn't have to be on it. Because the people who know what they're looking at know what your contribution to that success was.
Right.
Right. You don't have to buy a billboard in Times Square. Like, people who know what they're looking at see that, appreciate it, and understand the accomplishment. Right. And then I think that also creates opportunities, right? As new challenges come up within an organization, and senior leadership says, "Hey, who do we have who could tackle this kind of thing?" They don't go to some HR database and look at skills profiles and things like that, right? They say, "Hey, Bernie did a great job on this. I think he could. Let's try him in this other area. Give him a bigger challenge."
Yeah, because my fingerprints
were on it. Happen.
Yeah.
Because your fingerprints were on it. Exactly.
Yeah. Now, Jim. So let's talk about the role. I mean, this is the Social Business Engine podcast, right? So let's talk about the role that digital and social plays in all of this organizational collaboration. The way that you and I would have done that back in the 90s is different than the way you're probably doing it today.
It is. And today it's all about, building virtual networks of people with, kind of like interests, and giving them an opportunity as they participate in whatever that endeavor or project is, to, as a side benefit, maybe build and burnish their own personal brands, right? Like, a good example is, social selling is a hot topic these days,
mm-hmm,
right? And that's at its core the ability to influence the people that you want to influence, such as prospects and customers, in ways that would lead, using digital and social tactics in ways that would lead them to include you, or in sales cycles, or start new sales cycles with you that then lead to revenue. And so we've had a very aggressive program over the last few years to help our salespeople understand how that is now becoming the new way to sell, and that it's becoming not a nice to have, but a requirement of being a modern sales professional. And they're seeing the account execs who adopt these tactics, they're seeing the success that they're having, and that's kind of dragging along, the laggards to, now start to adopt some of these tactics. And then we're taking it to the next level of next generation, if you will, of really social ambassadorship across our entire customer base. Because when you think about it, we were talking about this the other day, if you have 10,000 people in your company, and each of them has 500 contacts in their social networks.
Mm-hmm.
That's access to 5 million people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so as you can enable people to function as social ambassadors for your brand in ways that are relevant to the relationships they have and the networks they have, you can really turn the dial on the awareness, the preference, and kind of the humanity that people associate, with your brand. Because I like Bernie, and Bernie is a good guy, and Bernie happens to work for this company, so maybe I should think better about that company. It's a very, very powerful, force.
Yeah,
and it's only really in its infancy.
Yeah, and there's definitely some psychology in that as well. But Jim, you wrote an article for Forbes Business, I think it's Forbes Brand Voice, and the title of the article is "Why Social Selling is Not About Selling." And I read it. I like it a lot. And so you want to kind of hit the treetops on the key points that you made in that article, since we're talking about social selling?
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. I'm glad you liked it. I think the name social selling is a little bit of a misnomer in that, I get that it's a new way to sell, in quotes. But if you look at how people successfully develop influence within social and digital networks and interactions with those people, it's by being authentic. It's by having a trusted voice. It's by listening to what other people are saying and responding in ways that advance the conversation. It's about expanding your network in ways that are natural, based on the things that you're interested in and the things that the members of that network are interested in. And none of those things I just said really says sell it, right?
Right.
And I think the four categories I used were right, like listening, content, voice, and network. And I think if you do those things sufficiently well over time, and you avoid pushing people too hard toward what you might call a transactional relationship, where I want you to buy something that I'm selling, it will naturally lead to selling opportunities and revenue. Because you buy from people you trust, you buy from people whose opinions you value, and you buy from people who have been there over time.
Right.
And all of those things happen when you do social selling well, and you focus more on the social and less on the selling. Right.
Now, Jim, do you encounter in an organization, enterprise the size of SAP, in your role, do you encounter what I'm going to call, and I'm using air quotes, we're on a podcast, this is audio only, so I have to describe that I'm using air quotes to make this point, what I'll call tradition.
I can imagine your fingers in the air.
My fingers are in the air, and they're squishing down as air quotes right now, and I'm putting them around the word traditionalists. And maybe we can even call them laggards, if you will. I think you used that word earlier in our conversation. Do you ever encounter those traditionalists or those laggards that are resistant to these modern ways of embracing digital and social engagement? And if you do, how do you deal with them?
That's a great question, and I do see that across all organizations, even within marketing, where you would think, they'd be more on the leading edge of adopting these new, these new strategies of how to engage. And part of it, I think, is driven from the fact that a lot of people associate what we're talking about with the millennial generation, right? And they think, because they haven't really maybe seen it work and the power that it has, because they haven't engaged, they see it as something that those kids do.
Right.
And I think until you dip your toe in the water and start to get involved with things like LinkedIn and building out a robust profile and joining groups and connecting to people and participating in Facebook and some of the other kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of where people can get started. I think a lot of people just don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side of it is, though, once they see it work, they're hooked. Right? They absolutely understand that, hey, I was able to get a meeting with this person because I listened to what they were saying online. I
Mm-hmm.
understood who they were and what they cared about, and I reached out to them in a way that felt natural. And they said, "Sure, come by next week, and let's talk about how you can help me." And so once they start to experience that, then they're hooked. But I do think there's a mindset at work that it's like I'm not in that demographic, right? I'm not a millennial, so this doesn't matter to me. And I use the phrase, and my kids always laugh at me when I say this, but I say, hey, I'm a 50-something millennial, because I'm doing all the stuff, right?
Yep.
And people who get it are engaging those ways, and it's more of a mindset and an attitude and an ability to really connect and use these tools that are out there than it is strictly an age thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. Hey, look, like I said earlier, Jim, we're in the same age range. I have a 24-year-old and a 19-year-old, and I actually mentioned on a previous podcast that my 19-year-old is now listening to podcasts, which I'm changing the topic a little bit. That was in the context of how podcasting is becoming more popular. But yeah, I agree with you. Once the doubters, if you will, experience it, taste it. I've always used the analogy, if I give you a bowl of ice cream of some flavor and you say I don't like it, and I say taste it, at least once you taste it, then you've experienced it and you know whether or not you like it. So they've got to experience it for themselves. So what I'd like to do, Jim, before I segue to my one thing question, I want to ask you one more question on this topic. And that is, you've been doing this for some time, and I'd like to get you to tell us some lessons learned. Share with us some things that you've learned along the way that maybe someone else in an enterprise that's in a similar role or going through sort of that internal process of getting people to embrace digital and social engagement and employee advocacy and social selling. What are some of the lessons learned that you can share with them?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's simple, but one of the key things is just do it. Right, to channel my inner Nike. You really don't understand if you're just observing what other people are doing and saying, "Gee, I'd like to do that," but I don't have time to write a blog, or I don't know how to build a profile, you'll never you'll never be able to leverage the magic of this stuff. And so, one thing I would say is start, get involved. The other is, be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think you if you're interesting, people don't care who you are, what company you work for, right? They want to hear what you have to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's very important. And I think also the listening piece is important. It's true as true online as it is in life. Right. Keep your mouth shut for a while. Listen to what people say, and don't try and dominate, the conversation or jump in before you understand the context of it.
Right.
And I was very pleased. This was about 2 years ago. We were in a meeting talking about social and digital and the need for all kinds of new content, right? Because that's a big piece of the engine that drives this whole thing is content. And somebody said, "Hey, you know what? We need more writers in this company. We need more English majors." And I was like, yes, the market has finally come back around.
Yeah.
To me. But that's the advice I would say. And it does involve some risk taking. It's easy not to, step out of your comfort zone. But I think if you do it intelligently in some of the ways we talked about, it's also very satisfying personally, beyond just the professional sphere. You feel like, you're getting your voice out there.
Right. Okay, terrific. So, Jim, here's what I'd like to do. Before I segue to my one thing question, I like to summarize kind of the key takeaways from the conversation that we just had, and then we'll get into my one thing question. So, here's what I heard from you, Jim. I like your opening remark about how you can be entrepreneurial in a large organization within the boundaries of what's possible, as long as you recognize what those boundaries are. And you talked about how you're looking at ways that you can engage prospects and customers earlier in their decision cycle so that you can build trust with them. You talked about how important it is to collaborate with people and showing them ways to engage through prototypes, not just by what-ifing, but actually prototype something with them or for them and then present it in a way that's a win-win scenario. And I love your point about how if your fingerprints are on something, then your name doesn't have to be on it because your name is already on it through your fingerprints. That's great. You also talked about building virtual networks with people of like interest to provide opportunities for them to participate and for them to build their personal brand, and enabling people to work as social ambassadors for your brand. And then we talked about social selling. You said social selling, the vernacular is kind of a misnomer. You said that it's about being authentic, having a trusted voice, listening, responding to advance the conversation, to expand the conversation. And then we talked about laggards, right? We talked about how if some of them think that it's what the kids do, but once they get engaged in social networking activities and actually experience it, especially when they experience a good outcome like getting a meeting, then they're hooked. And then I love your point about just doing it. Be interesting, be human, listen. And then we closed it up with the recognition that you need more writers and that you need to be willing to take some risks. So these are kind of the key takeaways from our conversation about how, Jim, you as an executive at SAP, heading up customer experience at SAP, is really making it happen. So did I miss anything from a key takeaway standpoint?
Bernie, that was a great summation. You take a lot better notes than I ever do. So thank you very much for that.
All right, cool. Well, let's segue now, Jim, to my one thing question. And you know that this is where I ask you if there's any one thing that you could change about the way that business is conducted today. What would that be?
I would say people need to allow themselves to have more fun.
Okay.
And allow themselves to be themselves in the workplace. I think a lot of people model behavior that they think they need to exhibit, maybe based on, what they've seen from other successful people or what they learned in school. And, I think they hold back their own true nature a bit too much. And, business is all about people.
Right.
And the more you can come across as a person and let your personality come through, the more successful you're going to be, frankly. And I think that naturally leads to, having more fun.
Yeah.
I mean, we spend more time with people in the office in a lot of cases than we do with our families.
That's true.
And a lot of people don't allow themselves to enjoy, their daily life as much as they should within the business world. So I think that's important. And, that's also where you're in a culture that understands and appreciates and celebrates that, you can't help but enjoy what you're doing.
Right.
So, I'm thinking a little bit of there's a little dust up recently about Amazon and their, what their culture may or may not be like. And, how in some organizations, the business objective sometimes gets in the way of the people objective. And I think it's important to have the right balance there.
Terrific. So have more fun, allow people to be themselves, and have a culture that supports and celebrates that.
That sounds good. I think I want to work at that company.
Sounds to me like you already do, Jim.
I do. I do. I'm very lucky. I've not to put in a plug for SAP, but I've worked in many companies over the years, and nobody can touch SAP in terms of their culture.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, Jim, before I segue to my little outro here, is there any place that you'd like to send people online to connect with you, or anything going on at SAP that you want to point people to online?
Yeah, I think the Forbes site that you mentioned earlier is a great place to see some of our thought leaders talking about all kinds of topics, and it's not by any means, commercial. It's very issues driven. Last year I wrote a much maligned article about 6 reasons why I thought the New York Jets would win the Super Bowl. We all know how that turned out. So there is,
talk about taking risk, Jim. Wow.
We're just looking foolish, right? That was one of my best performing blogs on Forbes, though, I have to say.
I can imagine. I'm sure.
Yeah.
It was.
So the SAP, there's an SAP Ad Voice channel on Forbes that I think is a great place to be, and also just the SAP.com website has been completely redesigned over the last 6 months or so, and I think has a lot of great content.
So SAP.com and the Forbes brand voice. And my listeners know that I will link that up in our show notes at socialbusinessengine.com. So Jim Fields, Vice President of Customer Experience at SAP, thank you so much for joining me here today to share your experience, your journey, your accomplishments, your insights. I know I appreciate it, and I know that my listeners appreciate it. And again, we'll have links to all that in our show notes. And I do want to remind folks that this episode is brought to you by Vanilla Forums. We are publishing a social business journal issue that is titled The Community Playbook. And if you're subscribed to receive our weekly podcast in your email inbox, you will get notified when we publish this journal. And if you're not subscribed, the way to do that, or one way to do that, is text SBE Show to 38470. Again, that's SBE Show to 38470. Or just subscribe at our website at socialbusinessengine.com. And hey, if you're a regular listener to the Social Business Engine podcast, have you written a review in iTunes yet? If not, would you take a minute and write a review? That helps increase the chance of other people discovering this podcast. And if you do write that review, please let me know so that I can give you my sincere thanks. I will gladly give you a shout out. Hey, if you have a social business story that you want to share on this podcast, or you know of one, reach out to me either through the contact page at socialbusinessengine.com or tweet me at Bernie Borges or at SBEngine. And remember to visit our show notes page at socialbusinessengine.com/podcast to get links to what I discuss here today with Jim Fields from SAP. That is going to do it for this episode. Until next time, this is your host, Bernie Borges of Find and Convert, wishing you continued success on your social business journey.